Hi class. So as you might expect from last week's discussion, this week we'll be beginning with an overview of language development. This will cover the various physiological and psychological processes at play regarding how we communicate. For our second lecture, we will be covering why we do what we do at any given time. Specifically, I'm talking about motivation, how it works, how we get it, how we lose it, and its relationship with emotion. Let's get started. What is language? What do you think? It may seem like a simple question, but what language is to you and what the meaning of language is to our society in general is a very important question for us to consider. So what do you think is the utility of the understanding of language to psychology? Well, play the video in the lecture links, and then we'll continue as we think about that question. So when we speak to someone, we produce a series of sounds in a continuous stream, punctuated by pauses and modulated by stresses and changes in pitch. When we speak sentences as a string of sounds, emphasizing some and quickly gliding over others. Any analysis of speech usually begins with its elements, or phonemes, which are the basic elements of speech. A good example that a textbook gives is the word pin. Pin contains the sounds p, I, and n. Many experiments have investigated how we discriminate among phonemes. One distinction we can detect relatively easily is onset time, or the delay between the initial sound of a consonant and the onset of the vibration of the vocal cords. The distinction between voiced and unvoiced consonants permits us to distinguish between similar sounding phonemes such as ba and pa, or t and g. As you can see, the difference here is somewhat subtle. Consider the pa sound. When you open your lips, the sound doesn't come out immediately because the air pressure in your mouth and throat keeps the air from leaving your lungs for a brief period of time. Your vocal cords do not vibrate until the air from your lungs passes through them. The delay in voicing that occurs when you say pa is very slight. Pa is therefore considered an unvoiced consonant. Ba, on the other hand, is thought of as a voiced consonant because you do not build up air pressure before your vocal cords activate. With the ba sound, your vocal cords start making sounds as soon as your mouth is opened. Phonemes combine together to form the smallest units of language which convey meaning. These are known as morphemes. Continuing to use the word pin as an example, we can see that the meaning of the word changes when we remove the p from pin, changing the word from pin to in. We can therefore see that in this example, both p and in are morphemes because they both contain meaning. Essentially, removal of either one changes the word. If we want a listener to understand our speech, we must follow the conventions or the rules of language, using words the listener or reader is familiar with, combining them in specific ways. This is referred to as syntax. Consider this as an example. There is snow in the forecast today. Understandable meaning right there. Versus forecast, the in there today is snow. There's no meaning. All languages have syntax or grammar. They follow certain principles which linguists call syntactical rules. If you don't follow those syntactical rules and you have the same words present but an unrecognizable order, then the sentence loses its meaning. So when we define syntactical rules, these are certain principles governing any language which makes language understandable. So if we think back to the previous lectures, you may remember that some learning occurs implicitly. Implicit learning also appears to be the case with syntactical rules. Our understanding of these rules does not need to be taught and occurs on its own. Semantics refers to the meaning of words. Semantics also provides important cues to the syntax of a sentence. Yet sometimes the meaning of words in a sentence alone may not be enough to fully and accurately derive meaning. Prosody refers to the varying rhythms, changes, and the ways that we stress different portions of words and different words in sentences. This aids in communicating the meaning of our sentences. So noted linguist, pictured here on the left, and MIT professor Noam Chomsky, theorizes that newly formed sentences are represented in the brain in terms of their meaning. This is referred to as deep structure. In order to speak or write a sentence, the person must transform the deep structure into an appropriate surface structure, or the particular form the sentence takes. Comprehension of speech also involves knowledge about the world and about particular situations an individual may encounter in it. Researchers have suggested that this knowledge is organized into scripts, which specify various types of events and event-related interactions that people have witnessed or have learned about from others. Once the speaker has established which script is being referred to, the listener can fill in the details. So now, pause this lecture and look at the required video number 2 on the list for this week. And we'll watch a section of that and then get back to the lecture because it's going to keep everything in context here. So assuming that you have now watched the video, we will continue on and discuss language disorders. So the process of identifying parts of the brain that are involved in language began in 1861 when Paul Broca, a French neurosurgeon, examined the brain of a recently deceased patient who had an unusual disorder. Though he had been able to understand spoken language and did not have any motor impairments of the mouth or tongue that might have affected his ability to speak, he could neither speak a complete sentence nor express his thoughts in writing. The only articulate sound he could make was the syllable tan, which had come to be used as his name. After Tan's death, Broca autopsied his brain, and he found a sizable lesion in the left inferior frontal cortex. Subsequently, Broca studied 8 other patients, all of whom had similar language deficits along with lesions in their left frontal hemisphere. This led him to make the famous statement that, quote, "we speak with the left hemisphere," and to identify for the first time the existence of a language center in the posterior portion of the frontal lobe in this hemisphere. Now known as Broca's area, this was in fact the first area of the brain to be associated with a specific function, in this case, language. 10 years later, Karl Wernicke, a German neurologist, discovered another part of the brain. This one involved in understanding language, in the posterior portion of the left temporal lobe. People who had a lesion at this location could speak, but their speech was often incoherent and made no sense. Wernicke's observations have been confirmed many times since. Neuroscientists now agree that running around the lateral sulcus, also known as the fissure of Sylvius, in the left hemisphere of the brain, there is a sort of neural loop that is involved in both understanding and producing spoken language. At the front end of this loop lies Broca's area, which is usually associated with the production of language or language outputs. At the other end, more specifically at the superior posterior temporal lobe, lies Wernicke's area, which is associated with processing of words that we hear being spoken or language inputs. Broca's area and Wernicke's area are connected by a large bundle of nerve fibers called the arcuate facilis. This language loop is found in the left hemisphere in about 90% of right-handed persons and 70% of left-handed persons, language being one of the functions that is performed asymmetrically in the brain. Surprisingly, this loop is also found at the same location in deaf persons who use sign language. This loop would therefore appear to not be specific to heard or spoken language, but rather more broadly associated with whatever the individual's primary language modality happens to be. So if they can understand or process language, it is involved in the same areas of the brain. In addition to Broca's and Wernicke's area, a third area of importance for language located in the parietal cortex has been described more recently. Now, you might ask yourself, what about the 40% who don't show signs of this language loop? Because I mentioned that it's a little bit more than that, right? So we're talking about 60% of people who do show signs of this language loop. Well, a general problem encountered in any attempt to determine the location of brain functions is that every brain is unique. Just as every normal human hand has 5 fingers, but everyone's hands are different, all human brains have the same major structures, but the size and shape of these structures can vary from one individual to another by as much as several millimeters. Average measurements can be used, of course, in studying the brain, but the fact remains that the same type of lesion will not always cause exactly the same deficit in several different individuals. So that's something important to keep in mind as well. Now, a first model of the general organization of language functions in the brain was proposed by American neurologist Norman Geschwind. And this he proposed in the 1960s and 1970s. So this connectionist model drew on the lesion studies done by Wernicke and his successors and is now known as the Geschwind-Wernicke model. Now, according to this model, each of the various characteristics of language, such as perception, comprehension, production, etc., is managed by a distinct functional model in the brain. And each of these modules is linked to the other by a very specific set of serial connections. Now, the central hypothesis of this model is that language disorders arise from breakdowns in this network of connections between these modules. According to this model, when you hear a word spoken, the auditory signal is processed first in your brain's primary auditory cortex, which then sends it on to neighboring Wernicke's area. Now, Wernicke's area associates the structure of this signal with the representation of a word stored in your memory, thus enabling you to retrieve the meaning of the particular word. In contrast, when you read a word out loud, the information is perceived by your visual cortex, which then transfers it to the angular gyrus, from which it's sent on to Wernicke's area. Whether you hear someone speak a word or read the word yourself, it's the mental lexicon in Wernicke's area that recognizes this word and correctly interprets it according to the context. For you then to pronounce this word yourself, this information must be transmitted via the arcuate facilis to a destination in Broca's area, which plans the pronunciation process. Lastly, this information is routed to the motor cortex, which controls the muscles that you use to pronounce the word. So this is a very complicated and interconnected system. The Wernicke-Geschwind model is thus based on the anatomical location of the areas of the brain that have distinct functions. On the whole, this model provides a good understanding of the primary language disorders, such as Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia, but it also has limitations. For one thing, its assumption that the various areas involved in processing speech are connected in series implies that one step must be completed before the next one can begin, which is actually not always the case. Because the model also fails to explain certain partial language disorders, other models have been proposed to address these shortcomings. In addition to semantic memory, which lets us retain the various meaning of words, we must use other specialized forms of memory in order to speak. For example, to pronounce any given phoneme of a language that you know how to speak, you must place your tongue and mouth in a particular position. They assume this position unconsciously, but obviously you must have it stored in memory somewhere in your brain. Now, perhaps the most striking anatomical characteristic of the human brain is that it's divided into two hemispheres, so that it has two of almost every structure, one on the left side and one on the right. But these paired structures are not exactly symmetrical and often differ in their size, form, and function. This phenomenon is called brain lateralization. The two most lateralized functions in the human brain are motor control and language. When a function is lateralized, this often means that one side of the brain exerts more control over the function, than the other side does. This side exerts more control, is often called the dominant hemisphere for this function, but this expression can be somewhat misleading. Now let's backtrack a bit so we understand lateralization in the context of brain development. The brain and the nervous system develops rapidly during the first 2 years of life. The most fully developed areas of the brain at birth are the medulla and the midbrain. Okay. So the brain, the most fully developed areas of the brain within the cerebral cortex is the higher seat of cognitive functioning, which is last to be developed. So let's say this one more time. The most fully developed areas of the brain at birth are the medulla and the midbrain, with the cerebral cortex, or the seat of our higher cognitive functions, being the least developed. The medulla regulates vital functions such as heartbeat and respiration, attention, sleeping, waking, elimination, and movement of the head and neck. The cortex is responsible for perception, body movement, thinking, and language. Specifically, in the first 2 years after birth, it is the primary motor, primarily the cortex that develops, although the dendrites continue to grow and the synapses continue to form throughout the nervous system. The last part of our brain to develop is the prefrontal area of the cortex. Lateralization of motor control is what determines whether someone is right-handed or left-handed. When someone is ambidextrous, when they can use either hand as easily as the other, it means that their brain is only partially lateralized or not lateralized for motor control at all. In right-handed people, the dominant hemisphere for motor control is the left, while in left-handed people, it's the right. The reason for this inversion is that motor pathways of the nervous system cross over to the other side of the body as they go down the spinal cord. Thus, the movement of one side of the body are controlled by the hemisphere on the opposite side. So about 9 out of 10 adults are right-handed, so the vast majority, about 90%. And this proportion seems to have remained stable over many thousands of years in all cultures in which it's been studied. As part of the dominance of one brain area over another, specific functions of the brain are lateralized, as shown in this figure to the right. Neurologists think that the basic outline of lateralization is probably genetically determined, whereas the specific timing of lateralization of each function is determined by an interaction of genes and experience as well. So the processes of lateralization are ones which occur quite a bit during early childhood. And during this period, we see the development and maturation of the corpus callosum, or the dense bundle of nerve fibers, which connect the left and right sides of the brain to one another. So some lateralization may already be present during fetal development. It's important to keep that in mind. Now, you might wonder what causes lateralization. If it's genetically determined, then is this something that we're born with, especially if some of it's already present during fetal development? Well, not exactly. Experience with language has been found to be the impetus behind lateralization, necessitating one side of the brain to gain more control over the rest of the brain and body. So since this is a lecture on language, your follow-up question might be, what is the dominant hemisphere for language? And is there any correlation between handedness and language lateralization? Well, considering how easily we can determine whether someone is right-handed or left-handed, if there were such a correlation, it might prove very useful for research. And indeed, this correlation does exist, but it's not perfect. In the vast majority of right-handed people, language abilities are localized in the left hemisphere. But contrary to what you might expect, the opposite is not true among left-handed people, for whom the picture is less clear. Many lefties show a specialization for language in the left hemisphere, but some show one in the right, while still for others both hemispheres contribute just about equally to language. So, though handedness does influence the brain hemisphere that people use to speak, the left hemisphere does seem to have a natural predisposition for language, and this predisposition is reflected anatomically. Now, moving out of the physiological sphere for a bit, when we think about language, what comes to mind? A means of communication, What modality? I mean, how do we think about the ways people communicate? Well, as we know, verbal language is not the only way that two people communicate with each other. Even before they open their mouths, they're already communicating through various nonverbal mechanisms. First of all, their physical appearance, the way they dress, the way they carry themselves. Their general attitude all form a context that leads a particular idea or verbal message about the person. Next, the particular position of their bodies during conversation, the way their eyes move, the gestures they make, the ways they mimic each other will also impart a certain emotional charge to what they say. There's also what's often called the music of language, the variations in tone, in rhythm, in inflection, that alter the meanings of words which we addressed in the last lecture. So when we are talking about language, it's therefore useful to distinguish between verbal language, the literal meaning of words, and everything that surrounds these words and gives them a particular connotation. That's the big difference between denoting and connoting. The message that is perceived never depends solely on what is said, but always on how it's said as well. Another good reason to distinguish between denotive and connotative aspects of language is that they call on different parts of the brain. In the great majority of people, it's the left hemisphere that formulates and understands the meaning of words and sentences, while the right hemisphere interprets the emotional connotation of these words. So, as a bit of review, in one of the last slides we mentioned the Wernicke-Geschwin model, or Geschwin-Wernicke model, in relation to Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. Let's end the lecture by going into a bit more detail as to specifically what these disorders are. The neural mechanisms that control speech production appear to be located in the frontal lobes. As previously mentioned, damage to Broca's area disrupts the ability to speak. This is characterized by slow, laborious, and non-fluent speech you cannot understand. The term aphasia specifically refers to deficits in the use or comprehension of language that generally are the result of brain damage. Now, although patients with this condition often mispronounce words, they do understand them, and the words that they manage to express are often meaningful. They know what they want to say, but the nature of the damage to their brain makes their actual expressions of speech sound somewhat telegraphic. Spoken language requires the production of spoken words, as well as the understanding of these words. Whereas damage to Broca's area affects the ability to speak, the ability to comprehend speech obviously begins in the auditory system, which is needed if the brain is to analyze sequences of sounds and recognize them as words. Listening is the first step in comprehension. Recognizing a spoken word is a complex perceptual task that relies on memories of sequences and sounds. This task appears to be accomplished by neural circuits in Wernicke's area, which resides in the upper part of the temporal lobe, the seat of the brain's auditory processing system. Brain damage in the left hemisphere that invades Wernicke's area, as well as the surrounding region of the temporal and parietal lobes, produces a disorder known as Wernicke's aphasia. The symptoms of Wernicke's aphasia are poor speech recognition and the production of meaningless speech. So here, the individual literally does not understand speech due to their brain damage. However, unlike Broca's aphasia, the speech that they do produce comes out relatively easily and is fluent and unlabored. In this condition, the patient does not strain to articulate words or appear to be searching for them. Given the speech deficits of the patient with Wernicke's aphasia, the clinical assessment of their ability to comprehend speech must rely on their nonverbal behavior. That is, we cannot assume that they do not understand what other people say to them just because they may not give a lucid answer. In commonly used tests of comprehension, clinicians assess these patients' ability to understand questions by asking them to point to an object on a table in front of them. They may be shown a pen and a pencil and asked to point to the one with ink. If they point to anything other than the pen or an object that is not related to ink, then they're assumed to not have understood the request. Because Wernicke's area is a region in the auditory cortex, and because a comprehension deficit is so prominent with Wernicke's aphasia, this disorder has been characterized as a receptive aphasia. So let's review key points from the video snippet that you were required to view. So children cannot be necessarily said to learn the rules of language from experience and witnessing their parents and older adults speak alone. How we know this is that children make what are known as overgeneralization errors, which expand past tense inflections in speech, which they have learned to apply to all verbs. Examples of this are hearing a sentence like, he dropped the ball, and applying it to other sentences in an improper form, such as, I sitted down. Other errors include overextension, the use of a word to denote a larger class of items than are appropriate, and the inverse, underextension, the use of a word to denote a smaller class of items than is appropriate. All three of these are errors which reflect the normal process of language acquisition. As children continue through the process of language development and language acquisition, they're aided by a process known as semantic priming, or the presentation of a previously known word which facilitates the recognition of words which have a related meaning. This essentially refers to parts of the brain that are keyed in to detect and interpret meaning and nature of words and how they are supposed to function in a sentence. So to understand language use disorders, we must understand how we receive information verbally. We do not receive information from the visual environment while the eyes are actually moving, but only during brief fixations. When we read, we typically focus on only about 80% of the content, the words that have core meaning in a sentence, and only 40% of the function words such as and the. So the average fixation only lasts about 250 milliseconds, but the duration can vary considerably. Most psychologists who study the reading process believe that readers have two basic ways to recognize words. Phonetic reading, which involves the decoding of the sounds of the letters or groups that the letters make, and whole word reading, which refers to our recognition of the word, the whole word as a unit, rather than the necessity of sounding out each word to understand it. Therefore, this relies on some implicit recall of learned word pronunciation and meaning. The best evidence demonstrating that people can read words without sounding them out comes from studies of patients with dyslexia. So, dyslexia by definition means faulty reading. Acquired dyslexias are those caused by damage to the brains of people who already know how to read, but perhaps the most commonly known dyslexias are those that are developmental in nature. These difficulties become apparent as children learn to read. There are several types of developmental dyslexia, including surface dyslexia, which is a deficit in whole word reading. The term surface reflects the fact that people with this disorder make errors related to the visual appearance of words and to the phonological rules, not to the meaning of words. Now we know that recognizing a word is different from understanding it. But direct dyslexia resembles a form of aphasia covered earlier on in the lecture, where people with this disorder can read words aloud even though they cannot understand what they are saying. So, what are the prevalence and causes? Well, the symptoms of developmental dyslexias resemble those of acquired dyslexias. They first manifest in childhood and tend to occur in families, suggesting a genetic component. And the prevalence rates internationally range from about 1% in Japan and China to 33% in Venezuela. In a cross-nation study, the average prevalence rate of developmental dyslexia is about 7%. So perhaps not surprisingly, researchers have implicated deficits in both Broca's and Wernicke's area in these disorders. All right, guys, that's all for this lecture. Be sure to respond to the required discussion questions for this week. Take care.